The skeptical smirks faded one by one as she adjusted her scope with methodical precision. They had laughed at her steady hands, dismissing her as just another recruit with delusions of grandeur. But that was before the colonel witnessed the impossible. A confirmed kill at 3,100 meters that would rewrite the record books. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The sun hung mercilessly over the training fields of Rajasthan, baking the earth until it cracked beneath the boots of 24 cadets. Heat waves distorted the distant targets, making the shooting range shimmer like a mirage. Sweat trickled down necks and soaked through uniforms as the group assembled for their afternoon marksmanship assessment. Anaya Singh stepped forward when her name was called, her slender frame appearing almost fragile among the broader shoulders of her male counterparts. The old, polished rifle she carried, a family heirloom rather than standard military issue, drew immediate attention. Whispers rippled through the formation as she took her position. "Is she serious with that antique?" one cadet muttered, loud enough for all to hear. "My grandmother has a more intimidating walking stick," another added, triggering a wave of poorly concealed laughter. Colonel Arvind Rathore stood at the edge of the range, clipboard in hand, his expression betraying nothing as he observed the scene. The decorated officer merely nodded for Anaya to proceed. The young woman positioned herself with methodical precision, seemingly oblivious to the mockery around her. Her breathing slowed visibly as she settled into position, fingers wrapping around the weathered stock with surprising confidence. The jeering continued, but she remained focused, as if alone in the vast desert landscape. "She looks calm because she doesn't understand what she's doing," a cadet named Dev Mehra announced. The scion of a prestigious military family, he watched with arms crossed and a smirk etched across his face. "That delicate grip won't handle the recoil." Anaya adjusted her stance slightly, compensating for the crosswind that rustled the sparse vegetation nearby. Her movements were economical, almost meditative. To the untrained eye, it might have appeared as hesitation, but the colonel's narrowed gaze suggested he recognized something the others missed. When she finally pulled the trigger, the crack of the rifle silenced all conversation. The bullet tore through the air, striking a target nearly twice the distance of what had been assigned, not just hitting it, but piercing the very center with surgical precision. The silence that followed was profound. Dev's smirk faltered, replaced by a furrowed brow. Other cadets squinted toward the distant target, disbelief evident in their postures. "Beginner's luck," someone finally offered, but the words lacked conviction. Anaya simply lowered her firearm, her expression unchanged. But as she turned to rejoin the ranks, a flicker of satisfaction crossed her features. Not pride, but quiet vindication. The colonel made a brief notation on his clipboard, his weathered face revealing nothing. In that moment, ridicule had transformed into something far more complex, an uneasy respect that none would openly acknowledge, but that would change everything in the days to come. Long before Anaya Singh ever touched a rifle, her hands had learned the language of precision. In the quiet evening hours of her childhood home in Rajasthan, she would sit cross-legged beside her grandmother, watching intently as gnarled fingers guided a needle through vibrant fabric. The old woman would hum softly, her voice blending with the distant calls of street vendors and the occasional honking of vehicles passing their modest dwelling. "Steady hands tell true stories," her grandmother would say, passing down an embroidery needle that gleamed in the warm lamplight. The intricate Rajasthani patterns demanded absolute concentration. One tremor, one moment of impatience, and hours of work could be ruined. Night after night, Anaya learned to control her breathing, to find stillness even when her fingers ached and her eyes grew heavy. What the cadets at the military training base couldn't understand was that the young woman's remarkable control hadn't been born in their shooting range. It had been cultivated through thousands of hours of threading needles by dim light, of counting stitches and holding patterns in her mind while her hands executed them flawlessly. The patience that allowed her to wait for the perfect moment between heartbeats before pulling a trigger had been forged in domestic silence. Meera Singh had watched her daughter's dedication to embroidery with pride, never imagining those same skills would translate to military prowess. She had hoped these feminine arts would lead Anaya toward a traditional life, not toward defying conventions at a military base. The irony wasn't lost on the young cadet as she applied the same techniques to an entirely different purpose. When Anaya held her firearm, she approached it with the same reverence she'd once given to her grandmother's precious fabrics. Her fingers found their position naturally, neither too tight nor too loose. Her breathing followed the same measured pattern she'd developed during those long evenings of embroidery. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 7, exhale for 8. Time slowed as she focused, the world narrowing to a single point, just as it had when she guided a needle through silk. The other cadets saw only the end result, a bullet finding its mark with uncanny precision. They couldn't see the years of discipline behind each shot, couldn't understand how skills they dismissed as trivial women's work had transformed into something they couldn't match despite their physical advantages and bravado. In the barracks at night, she sometimes took out a small piece of unfinished embroidery, her fingers tracing the patterns as she prepared mentally for the next day's challenges. These moments connected her to her past while strengthening her for the future, a secret source of power that none of her peers could comprehend or take from her. Colonel Arvind Rathore stood motionless at the edge of the firing range, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he observed the afternoon's training session. 4 decades in uniform had earned him not only the rows of medals adorning his chest, but also an instinct for talent that transcended conventional wisdom. The decorated officer's eyes narrowed as he watched Anaya Singh adjust her stance and control her breathing with a discipline that seemed almost unnatural for a cadet so new to the program. "Sir, perhaps we should focus on the senior cadets," suggested Captain Sharma at his side. "The demonstration squad selection is only 3 weeks away." The colonel nodded without shifting his gaze from Anaya. Something in her technique reminded him of his own mentor from years past. The same economy of movement, the same patient exhale before each shot. Yet tradition dictated that women rarely advanced to specialized marksmanship roles, particularly in the demonstration squads that represented the regiment to visiting dignitaries and the public. "Her scores are unexpected," he finally said, his voice betraying neither approval nor dismissal. When the session ended, Arvind walked slowly among the targets, pausing longest at Anaya's. The grouping was tight, methodical, the work of someone who understood that shooting was less about strength and more about consistency. He ran his finger along the paper's edge, remembering the whispers and raised eyebrows when he had first allowed her to join the advanced training cohort. That evening, alone in his office, the colonel reviewed Anaya's file. Her background was unremarkable. Daughter of Meera Singh, a homemaker from a modest family near Pushkar. No military lineage, no special connections. Just raw talent and determination that seemed to defy every expectation. The telephone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Rathore speaking," he answered. "Colonel, it's General Bakshi, about the demonstration squad roster. I trust you're selecting candidates with the appropriate profile. The Minister of Defense will be attending." Arvind understood the unspoken directive. The demonstration squad had always been the regiment's public face, traditionally male, traditionally from certain backgrounds. "Of course, sir. The selection process is underway." After hanging up, he returned to Anaya's file, his fingers drumming against the desk. Including her would raise questions, challenge protocols established long before his time. Yet excluding her meant denying what his eyes had clearly seen. The colonel closed the folder and gazed out at the darkening Rajasthani landscape. Tomorrow he would test her further, not because he doubted her ability, but because what lay ahead for her, for both of them, would require more than mere talent. It would demand the kind of resilience that could withstand the weight of breaking tradition. The monsoon arrived with unforgiving force, transforming the Rajasthan training grounds into a muddy obstacle course. Raindrops hammered against metal targets, creating a constant percussion that tested even the most focused cadets. Anaya Singh watched as her fellow trainees struggled against nature's onslaught, their frustrations mounting with each passing day. Her own trusted rifle, the weathered but reliable firearm that had become an extension of her hands, began showing signs of distress. The humidity crept into every crevice, and despite her meticulous cleaning routine each evening, rust spots appeared like unwelcome freckles along the barrel. "That antique won't last another week in this weather," Dev Mehra remarked with a smirk as they sheltered under a canvas tarp. The proud cadet from a military family seemed almost pleased by her predicament. "Perhaps it's time to admit defeat and request standard-issue equipment like the rest of us." Anaya merely nodded, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her concern. That night, she worked until her fingers ached, carefully treating each metal component with protective oil borrowed from Ravi Desai. "The monsoon is merciless on these old mechanisms," the mechanic warned, as he showed her how to protect the firing pin. "But this rifle has character. It survived worse than a little rain." The following morning, Colonel Arvind Rathore announced a critical drill, timed shots in adverse conditions. As cadets took their positions, the rain intensified, turning gentle drops into stinging projectiles. When Anaya's turn came, she settled into position, exhaled slowly, and squeezed the trigger. Nothing happened. The rifle had jammed. Whispers rippled through the ranks as she remained perfectly still, her face betraying no panic. The colonel watched, with narrowed eyes, clipboard shielded from the downpour. With methodical precision, she disassembled the chamber mechanism, fingers moving with the same delicate confidence she once applied to embroidery needles under her grandmother's guidance. Within seconds, she cleared the obstruction, reassembled the weapon, and resumed her stance. Her first shot hit dead center. The second and third followed with equal precision. Despite the rain now falling in sheets around her, "Time," called the colonel, his expression unreadable beneath his dripping cap. Later, as she cleaned her rifle in the barracks, Ravi approached with a small toolkit. "I saw what you did out there," he said quietly. "Most would have panicked." She shrugged. "Panic doesn't improve accuracy." From across the room, she caught Dev watching her with an expression that had shifted from mockery to something closer to curiosity. The young woman knew most still expected her to fail, still waited for the inevitable moment when she would prove unequal to the challenge. But the monsoon had taught her something valuable. Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in avoiding obstacles, but in adapting when they appear. The vibrant colors of the Pushkar Camel Fair spilled across the horizon as Anaya Singh returned home for the weekend. Merchants' calls and the scent of spiced chai filled the air, a stark contrast to the rigid discipline of the training grounds. Inside their modest home, Meera Singh waited with nervous energy, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of her cotton sari. "I've invited the Sharma family for dinner next week," Meera announced, placing a steaming cup of tea before her daughter. "Their son Vikram has a good government position. He's kind, well-educated." Anaya's hands, steady enough to hit targets hundreds of meters away, suddenly trembled around her cup. "An arranged marriage? Now? You're 23, Beta. The neighbors talk." Meera's voice softened. "This military dream, it brings only hardship. I see the bruises you hide, the exhaustion in your eyes." Outside, camel bells jingled as traders paraded their decorated animals through dusty streets. The festive atmosphere felt at odds with the tension building between mother and daughter. "I'm not giving up the camp," Anaya said firmly. "Not when I'm finally making progress." Mira's eyes welled with tears. What future is there for you? A woman with a rifle instead of a family? The colonel and those men will never truly accept you. The weight of tradition hung heavy in the small room. For generations, women in their community had followed the same path: marriage, children, a life defined by family bonds. Anaya's pursuit represented more than ambition. It was a rejection of everything her mother understood. "You don't understand what this means to me," Anaya whispered, her voice steady despite the storm inside. "Every day I stay is another day I prove it's possible." "And what of security? Of respect?" Mira placed her weathered hand over her daughter's calloused one. "I want more for you than struggle and disappointment." The homemaker's fears weren't unfounded. In the 4 months since Anaya had joined the training program, she'd faced mockery, sabotage, and isolation. Yet each obstacle had only strengthened her resolve. "Meeting the Sharmas won't hurt," Mira pleaded. "Just one dinner." Anaya stood, the chair scraping against the floor. "I can't pretend to consider something that would end everything I've worked for." As evening descended over Pushkar, the rift between them deepened. Mira turned away, busying herself with dinner preparations, her silence more painful than any argument. Anaya retreated to the small courtyard, where she practiced her breathing techniques under the emerging stars. 2 paths stretched before her, one worn smooth by generations of women, the other untraveled and uncertain. The weight of expectation pressed harder than ever between them, heavier than any rifle she'd ever carried. The moon cast long shadows across the firing range as Anaya Singh slicked between the equipment sheds. The base had fallen quiet hours ago, with only the occasional patrol breaking the stillness. She clutched her rifle close, moving with the same deliberate precision she applied to her shots. "You're late," Ravi Desai whispered from the darkness of the maintenance shed. The young mechanic's workspace smelled of gun oil and metal, illuminated only by a small lamp covered with a cloth to dim its glow. "I was beginning to think you'd given up." "Never," Anaya replied, carefully placing her weapon on his workbench. "The colonel had us running drills until sunset." Ravi nodded, his nimble fingers already examining the rifle's action. "I've been thinking about the recoil issue. With a few adjustments to the stock and a custom-weighted bolt, you might gain another 100 meters of accurate range." These midnight sessions had begun 3 weeks ago, after Anaya had overheard the other cadets discussing how the colonel would never select a woman for the demonstration squad. Rather than accept defeat, she had sought out the one person on base who might help her overcome the limitations of her standard-issue equipment. "Won't these modifications be noticed?" she asked, watching as he carefully measured components. "Only by someone who knows what they're looking for," the mechanic replied, his voice betraying both pride and nervousness. "And if they are, we both know what that means." Anaya understood the risk. Unauthorized modifications to military equipment could result in immediate dismissal for her and possibly worse for Ravi. Yet here they were, conspirators in the quiet hours, united by shared ambition and the thrill of defying expectations. "Hold this steady," he instructed, guiding her hands to brace a component while he worked. "Just like that, the same way you hold your breath before firing." For 2 hours they worked in near silence, communicating through nods and whispers. Ravi explained each modification, teaching her not just how to use the improved weapon, but how to maintain it herself. Their friendship had deepened through these sessions, forged in shared risk and mutual respect. "Try it now," he finally said, stepping back from the workbench. Anaya lifted the rifle, feeling its familiar weight now subtly altered. She braced it against her shoulder, sighting along the barrel toward an imaginary target. The balance was perfect, lighter, yet somehow more stable. "Tomorrow night, we'll test it properly," she whispered, lowering the weapon. "Far range where no one will hear." Ravi smiled, wiping oil from his hands. "He'll never expect what you're capable of now." As she slipped back toward the barracks, rifle concealed, Anaya felt a quiet confidence growing. In these secret hours, far from the jeers and doubts of daylight, she and Ravi were rewriting rules never meant to bend for people like them. Dev Mehra stood tall among the gathered cadets, his posture reflecting generations of military heritage. The morning sun glinted off his perfectly polished boots as he approached Anaya Singh with deliberate steps. "Let's settle this once and for all," Dev announced, his voice carrying across the training yard. "A shooting contest, 10 rounds, increasing difficulty." His challenge wasn't merely issued, it was performed, a spectacle designed to put the woman in her place while entertaining his admirers. Anaya merely nodded, her calm demeanor infuriating him more than any verbal retort could have. The young cadet's silence spoke volumes, a quiet confidence that made Dev's skin prickle with irritation. Word spread quickly through the base. By afternoon, nearly every off-duty soldier had gathered around the range. Some perched on equipment crates while others leaned against vehicles, all eager to witness what many assumed would be Anaya's humiliation. "Ladies first," Dev said with exaggerated courtesy, gesturing toward the firing line. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Anaya took position without acknowledging the mockery. She lifted her old rifle, the one many had ridiculed, and settled into her stance. Her breathing slowed visibly as she squeezed the trigger. The target, positioned at 300 meters, showed a perfect center hit. Dev matched her shot with practiced efficiency, his expensive firearm gleaming in the harsh Rajasthani sun. "Beginner's luck," someone called out as Anaya prepared for her second attempt. As the contest progressed, targets moved farther back, 500 meters, 700. Each time, Anaya fired with the same methodical precision that had first caught Colonel Rathor's attention. The crowd's jeers gradually subsided, replaced by murmurs of grudging appreciation. By the 8th round, Dev's confidence had visibly faltered. He studied his opponent's technique with growing fascination, the way she adjusted for wind differently than their instructors had taught, how she seemed to time her shots between heartbeats. "You didn't learn that here," he said during a brief pause to reset targets. "No," she replied simply. "My grandmother taught me patience while embroidering. The rest I figured out myself." The final round brought them to 1,000 meters. Dev fired first, striking just outside the center ring. A respectable shot that would have impressed anyone before today. When Anaya stepped up, complete silence fell over the gathering. She took longer than usual, feeling the subtle desert crosswinds. When she finally fired, the bullet struck dead center. Dev's admirers dispersed quickly, uncomfortable with the outcome. But the military scion himself lingered, studying Anaya with new eyes, respect and curiosity replacing his former contempt. "Tomorrow," he said quietly, "same time, I want to learn that wind technique." It wasn't friendship, not yet, but in that moment, rivalry had transformed into something far more valuable. Colonel Arvind Rathor's announcement came during the morning assembly, his voice carrying across the dusty parade ground. "Cadet Singh will join the demonstration squad effective immediately." The words hung in the air like the desert heat, followed by a ripple of murmurs among the assembled cadets. Anaya Singh stood motionless, her face betraying no emotion despite the storm brewing inside her. The demonstration squad was the elite group that represented the base at official functions and competitions. No woman had ever been selected before. After dismissal, the colonel beckoned her to his office, a sparse room adorned only with faded photographs of military ceremonies and a map of Rajasthan's terrain. "This is not charity, Singh," he said, his weathered face unreadable. "Your consistency has earned you this position, but understand this clearly. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and you're out." His eyes, sharp as rifle sights, held hers. "Many are watching, waiting for you to fail." Anaya nodded. "I understand, sir. Thank you for the opportunity." That evening in the barracks, the whispers followed her like shadows. Dev Mehra leaned against a wall, arms crossed. "The colonel's taking quite a risk," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let's hope his gamble doesn't embarrass us all at the governor's visit." "Perhaps he lost a bet," another cadet suggested, triggering laughter. Ravi found her later at the maintenance shed, methodically cleaning her rifle. The mechanic's hands were stained with oil as he sat beside her. "Congratulations," he said quietly. "Though I suspect it doesn't feel much like a victory yet." "It's not," Anaya replied, her fingers working the cleaning rod with practiced precision. "It's just another test." The following days were brutal. Training with the demonstration squad meant waking before dawn and practicing until her shoulders ached and fingers blistered. The other squad members maintained a cool distance, their cooperation professional but minimal. During one particularly grueling session, her rifle jammed twice. Though she cleared the malfunction quickly, she caught the colonel watching her, his expression impossible to read. That night, Anaya called her mother. Mira's voice was tinged with worry rather than pride. "Is this worth it, Beta? All this struggle?" "It has to be," she answered, watching the stars over the base through her window. When she returned to the range the next morning, Anaya arrived an hour early. Each shot she fired was a statement, not just of skill, but of her right to stand where she stood. The rifle's weight against her shoulder had become familiar as breathing, each trigger pull a heartbeat. She knew every eye watched for failure, every ear listened for the sound of her missing the mark. But in that pressure, Anaya found a strange clarity. Each bullet that struck center target wasn't just scoring points, it was carving out space in a world that had never made room for her. The air around the military base hummed with Diwali energy. Strings of colorful lights adorned the perimeter, and the distant pop of firecrackers punctuated the evening like sporadic gunfire. Anaya Singh had just positioned herself at the firing line when darkness swallowed the training grounds without warning. "Power cut!" someone shouted as emergency protocols activated. Colonel Arvind Rathor's voice cut through the confusion. "Continue the exercise. This is now a night vision test." But there was a problem. Their night vision equipment had been sent for maintenance. In the pitch-black darkness, most cadets lowered their weapons, accepting defeat before they began. Not Anaya. "Sir, permission to continue without aids," she requested, her voice steady despite the darkness. The colonel's silhouette shifted against the faint glow of distant festival lights. "Proceed at your own risk, Singh." Anaya closed her eyes, allowing her other senses to sharpen. The scent of marigold garlands hung heavy in the air, mixing with gunpowder and the earthy smell of Rajasthan after sunset. She could hear Dev Mehra shifting uncomfortably 2 stations down, the familiar creak of his boots against the ground. Taking a deep breath, she recalled her grandmother's lessons during embroidery sessions. "Your fingers must learn to see what your eyes cannot." Anaya adjusted her stance, feeling the weight of her rifle, an extension of herself. The distant crack of celebratory fireworks provided rhythm to her breathing. She listened intently for the subtle ping of the automated target system, calculating distance through sound alone. She fired 5 shots in succession, each one deliberate, guided by instinct rather than sight. When emergency generators finally hummed to life 15 minutes later, the training ground gradually reappeared in pools of yellow light. Cadets blinked, adjusting to the sudden brightness. All eyes turned toward the electronic scoreboard. 4 bullseyes. 1 shot just millimeters from perfect center. "Impossible," whispered Dev, his usual arrogance momentarily forgotten. Even Ravi Desai, who had slipped away from his mechanical duties to watch from the shadows, stood speechless. Colonel Rathor approached the firing line, his weathered face unreadable. "Explain your method, cadet." "Sound triangulation, sir. The target mechanisms make distinct noises at different distances. I simply listened." The colonel nodded once, a gesture so slight it might have been imagined. Sometimes the greatest skill isn't in what we see, but in what we perceive beyond sight. As the Diwali lights flickered back to full strength across the base, Something shifted in the atmosphere. The other cadets regarded Anaya with newfound respect, perhaps even a touch of superstition. Her ability to find precision in darkness had transformed her from curiosity to legend. That night, as celebrations continued across India, Anaya knew she had passed a test far more significant than marksmanship. She had demonstrated that her focus transcended mechanical skill. It was intuitive, almost mystical in its perfection. Colonel Arvind Rathore sat alone in his office, the ceiling fan spinning lazily overhead as evening descended on the Rajasthan dais. The stack of papers before him contained evaluations of the demonstration squad. But his eyes kept returning to one name, Anaya Singh. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Brigadier Sharma entered without waiting for a response, his expression stern beneath his meticulously groomed mustache. "You know why I'm here, Arvind," the brigadier said, settling into the chair across from him. "The girl has no place in the demonstration squad. Her presence makes us look desperate, not progressive." The colonel's jaw tightened. "She outperforms half the men, sir." "That's hardly the point." Sharma leaned forward. "The ministry officials will be watching. What happens when she falters under real pressure? The reputation of this entire base is at stake." After the brigadier left, Arvind poured himself a small measure of whiskey, something he rarely indulged in. Through the window, he could see cadets returning from evening drills. Anaya walked among them, somehow both part of the group and separate from it. The decorated officer rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of 35 years of service pressing down on him. His entire career had been built on following protocol, respecting hierarchy, maintaining traditions that had shaped India's military excellence. Yet something about this situation felt fundamentally wrong. His phone buzzed with a message from General Kapoor. "Reconsider your demonstration team roster. Some traditions exist for good reason." Arvind set the device down harder than necessary. The pressure was mounting from every direction. 3 separate commanding officers had casually mentioned their concerns about including a woman in such a visible role. He opened his drawer and withdrew a faded photograph, himself as a young lieutenant standing beside his mentor, Major Patel, the same man whose markings, unknown to anyone else, adorned Anaya's rifle. What would Patel have done? Duty or fairness, he muttered to the empty room. Tradition or talent? The colonel knew his decision would ripple far beyond one cadet's future. If he removed Anaya from the squad, he would reinforce decades of limitation. If he kept her, he risked his own standing, the respect of his peers, perhaps even his promotion prospects. As darkness fell completely over the base, Arvind made notes for tomorrow's roster. Whatever choice he made would define not just Anaya's path, but the legacy he would leave behind. A legacy caught between the rigid structures of the past and the uncertain promise of a changing world. He closed his eyes, the weight of command never feeling heavier than in this moment of choice. The monsoon had passed, leaving behind a chill that seeped into Anaya Singh's bones as she practiced her stance for the 7th hour straight. Her shoulders ached with a dull, persistent throb, but she refused to lower her rifle. The pain had become a familiar companion, like the weight of the weapon against her cheek. "You've been at it since dawn," Ravi called from the maintenance shed. "Even machines need rest." She ignored him, focusing on her breathing. 4 seconds in, 6 seconds out. The rhythm was sacred, unbreakable. Yesterday, Colonel Arvind Rathore had ordered her to take 48 hours of medical leave after noticing her wince during drills. She had nodded respectfully, then returned to the range at first light. Back at home, dinner grew cold on the table. Meera Singh sat alone, the empty chair across from her a silent accusation. When Anaya finally arrived past midnight, her mother didn't speak, only pushed a plate of reheated dal toward her daughter with trembling hands. "The festival is tomorrow," Meera said finally, her voice tight. "Your cousins asked about you." "I can't, Ma. The demonstration squad has..." "The squad, the range, the colonel," her mother interrupted. "Our neighbors don't ask about your shooting anymore. They ask if you're still alive." Anaya stared at her untouched food. The distance between them stretched wider than any target she'd ever aimed for. She wanted to explain that each hour of practice was necessary, that every missed family gathering was a sacrifice towards something greater. Instead, she whispered, "I'm sorry," words that had become as routine as her breathing exercises. The next morning, she ignored the swelling in her right wrist. Wrapping it tightly before anyone could notice, Devmera caught her grimacing as she lifted her firearm. "That looks serious," he remarked, genuine concern replacing their usual competitive tension. "It's nothing," she replied, adjusting her grip. Later, when her shots began drifting right, the colonel approached. His weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes narrowed at her bandaged wrist. "Excellence demands sacrifice, Singh," he said quietly. "But a sniper with a permanent injury is useless to everyone." She nodded stiffly, but as soon as he walked away, she resumed her position. The pain had become a measuring stick, each throb a reminder of how far she'd come, how much further she needed to go. That night, finding her bed empty again, Mira left a small package on Anaya's pillow. Pain relief balm and a handwritten note. "Your hands matter to more than just the military." Anaya found it at dawn, fingers tracing the familiar handwriting before tucking it into her pocket. Some sacrifices were visible, the injuries, the exhaustion. Others remained hidden, the birthdays missed, the relationships strained, the silent meals in empty rooms. Yet with each passing day, her determination only hardened, like calluses forming over tender skin. The aroma of cardamom chai filled the modest Singh household as Anaya returned from another grueling day at the base. Her shoulders ached from the recoil of countless shots, but she refused to show weakness, even in the privacy of home. Mira Singh sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through old photographs, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the evening lamp. "You missed dinner again," Mira said, her voice carrying more resignation than anger. "I saved some dal and roti for you." Anaya nodded silently, too exhausted for their usual argument about her military pursuits. She noticed an unfamiliar wooden box beside her mother, its lid open to reveal yellowed newspaper clippings. "What are those?" she asked, curiosity momentarily overriding fatigue. Mira hesitated, then handed her daughter a faded photograph. In it, a younger version of her mother stood on a small stage, microphone in hand, eyes closed in passionate performance. "I was 19, Mira explained, her fingers tracing the image. "The All-Rajasthan Folk Music Competition. I placed second." Anaya stared in disbelief. "You never told me you sang professionally." "Not professionally," her mother corrected. "But it was everything to me. I had offers to tour with a classical ensemble." She closed the box with a gentle finality. "Then my parents arranged my marriage to your father, and tradition demanded I choose." The revelation hung between them, reshaping everything Anaya thought she understood about her mother's opposition. "You gave it up," Anaya whispered. "I did what was expected," Mira replied, "and I don't regret my family, my life." She reached across the space between them, touching her daughter's calloused hand. "But I regret the silence afterward, the way the dream died without a fight." Anaya saw her mother clearly for the first time, not as an obstacle to her ambitions, but as a mirror reflecting what might have been. The woman who had pushed her toward traditional marriage wasn't acting from disapproval, but from the shadow of her own surrendered passion. "Is that why you've been so against the shooting?" Anaya asked. Mira nodded slowly. "I see your determination, and it terrifies me. Not because I think you'll fail, but because I know what it costs to walk away from something that burns inside you." That night, they sat together longer than they had in years. The daughter spoke of her struggles at the base, the constant need to prove herself. The mother shared stories of melodies once memorized, now faded like the photographs. Neither mentioned the rifle waiting at the base or the wedding proposals gathering dust. Instead, they found common ground in the understanding that passion, whether expressed through a perfect shot or a perfect note, demanded the same courage to pursue. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the training grounds as Colonel Arvind Rathore summoned Anaya Singh to his office. The weathered building stood apart from the barracks, its walls holding decades of military decisions. Anaya's heart raced as she knocked on the heavy wooden door, wondering what warranted this private meeting. "Enter," came the colonel's voice, firm, yet somehow hesitant. The decorated officer sat behind his desk, fingers steepled before him. For a moment, he simply studied her, his eyes revealing an internal struggle. Finally, he gestured toward the chair opposite him. "You've exceeded expectations, Singh," he began, using her surname as military protocol demanded. "But there's something you should know." The colonel rose and moved to the window, his silhouette framed against the fading light. "Your place on the demonstration squad wasn't earned the way you believe." Anaya's stomach tightened. "Sir? Major Kapoor bet me you wouldn't last 2 weeks," he continued, his voice low. "I took that bet, not because I believed in you, but to silence the skeptics, to prove a point about my authority." The words landed like physical blows. All those nights of secret practice, the blisters on her hands, the sacrifice of family time, reduced to a wager between officers. Her admission hadn't been about talent or dedication. It had been a gamble. "I see," she managed, her voice steady despite the turmoil within. "You've proven me wrong," the colonel admitted, turning to face her. "What began as a bet has become something else entirely. Your performance has been remarkable." But Anaya barely heard the praise. The revelation burned through her, transforming from shock to something harder, more determined. If her presence was a bet, then she would ensure the colonel won it beyond any measure. "Thank you for your honesty, sir," she replied, standing straighter. "Will that be all?" The colonel nodded, surprised by her composure. As Anaya turned to leave, he added, "The regional demonstration is in 3 weeks. The generals will be watching." Outside, she leaned against the building's wall, letting one moment of vulnerability surface before burying it deep. Ravi spotted her from across the yard and approached cautiously, noticing her expression. "What happened?" he asked. "I was a bet," she answered simply. "The colonel never believed in me." Her friend's face darkened with anger, but Anaya shook her head. "It doesn't matter now. I'm going to make that bet the best decision he ever made." That night, as she cleaned her rifle with methodical precision, the knowledge transformed within her. A wound becoming a weapon. Each component she reassembled a piece of her renewed determination. The colonel's confession had given her something unexpected, freedom from seeking approval. Now she would shoot for herself alone. The Pushkar camel fair transformed the dusty town into a vibrant explosion of color and commerce. Anaya Singh had not planned to participate in any official capacity, but when the colonel suggested a small demonstration to entertain visiting dignitaries, she couldn't refuse the opportunity to showcase her skills. The makeshift range was nothing like the controlled environment of the base. Surrounded by curious onlookers, street vendors, and the occasional wandering camel, Anaya positioned herself with the same calm focus she maintained during training. Her rifle, now familiar as an extension of her own body, rested comfortably against her shoulder. "That slip of a girl thinks she can shoot?" a man whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. The crowd's amusement quickly dissolved into gasps as she hit target after target with unerring precision, each shot more difficult than the last. What began as a simple demonstration evolved into something more significant when a local reporter captured her performance on his smartphone. By evening, Anaya's image appeared on regional news sites, and by morning, several newspapers carried the story of the marksman maiden of Rajasthan. "This is exactly what I feared," Meera lamented, spreading the newspaper across their kitchen table. "Everyone is talking about you now. Some praise, yes, but others question whether this is proper for a young woman. The young cadet felt the weight of her mother's concern, but couldn't deny the pride that swelled within her chest, seeing her accomplishments acknowledged beyond the base. Back at training, Colonel Arvind Rathore called her into his office, his expression unreadable. "The publicity was unexpected," he said, tapping a finger on the newspaper. "Higher command has taken notice." "Is that good or bad, sir?" Anaya asked, standing at attention. The decorated officer sighed. "Both. You've attracted sponsors interested in supporting female shooters, but you've also drawn scrutiny from traditionalists who believe women should not be in such roles." Dev Mehra approached her later that day in the mess hall. "Becoming a celebrity?" he asked, but without his usual competitive edge. "Hardly my intention," she replied, stirring her chai absently. "The colonel's superiors are watching you now," Dev warned. "Every shot you take carries more weight than before." Ravi found her that evening, working late on her rifle. "The newspaper called you a pioneer," he said with a smile. "But I've seen the comments online. Not everyone is cheering." Anaya nodded, running her fingers along the barrel of her firearm. "I didn't ask for this attention." "No," the mechanic agreed, "but now that you have it, what will you do with it?" She looked up at her friend, determination hardening in her eyes. "The same thing I've always done. Prove them wrong, one shot at a time." The oil lamp cast long shadows across the workshop as Anaya Singh and Ravi Desai hunched over her rifle. The base had gone quiet hours ago, but sleep eluded them both. A stubborn firing pin had been causing inconsistencies during practice, and tomorrow's drills left no room for equipment failure. "Hand me that file," Ravi whispered, his fingers working with practiced precision. The mechanic had developed a deep respect for Anaya's dedication, staying late to ensure her weapon performed flawlessly. Anaya passed him the tool, watching intently as he disassembled the bolt assembly. "My father always said a soldier is only as good as their equipment," she murmured, rubbing exhaustion from her eyes. As Ravi tilted the rifle under the lamp, something caught his attention. "Wait," he said, voice suddenly tense. "Look at this." He pointed to a series of tiny marks etched into the metal beneath the stock, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. Anaya leaned closer, squinting at the faint inscription. "I thought this was just an old service rifle." "What are those?" "Not just marks," Ravi replied, excitement building in his voice. "These are master marksman notations. See this symbol and these numbers?" His finger traced the delicate engravings. This belonged to Vikram Chauhan. The name hit Anaya like a physical force. Every cadet knew of Chauhan, a legendary marksman whose precision shooting had become military folklore. "That's impossible," she whispered. "Colonel Rathore mentioned once that Chauhan was his mentor," Ravi continued, carefully reassembling the weapon. "This rifle has history, Anaya, real history." She took the firearm back, feeling its weight differently now. All these months, she'd been shooting with a piece of living legacy, one connected directly to Colonel Arvind Rathore himself. The weapon she'd been mocked for choosing, the one deemed outdated by her peers, carried the silent endorsement of greatness. "Do you think the colonel knows?" she asked, running her fingers over the stock. Ravi shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. Military equipment gets reassigned all the time." For hours afterward, Anaya sat alone on the workshop floor, cradling the rifle. Everything shifted in her mind. This wasn't just her fight anymore. She was carrying forward something greater, a lineage of precision and quiet excellence that had come before her. When dawn broke over the Rajasthan desert, painting the sky in amber and gold, she finally rose. The rifle felt lighter somehow, as if the revelation had transferred some of its burden to the ghosts of the past. Those who had defied expectations before her now stood silently at her side. Tomorrow, when she took aim, she wouldn't be alone. The workshop fell silent as Colonel Arvind Rathore stood in the doorway, his shadow stretching across the floor where parts of Anaya's rifle lay disassembled. Ravi Desai froze, a custom-machined bolt in his hands, caught in the act of making unauthorized modifications to military equipment. The colonel's face remained impassive, but his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the scene. "Explain yourself, Desai," he commanded, his voice cutting through the tension. Ravi's hands trembled slightly as he set down the component. "Sir, I was improving the firing mechanism to enhance long-range accuracy," he admitted, standing at attention despite the fear evident in his eyes. Word spread through the base like wildfire. By morning, everyone knew the mechanic had been caught tampering with Anaya Singh's rifle. The whispers in the mess hall grew louder with each passing hour. "She couldn't do it on her own," one cadet sneered. "Had to cheat with special modifications." Anaya walked with her head high despite the sideways glances and hushed conversations that stopped when she approached. The accusations weighed heavily on her shoulders. Everything she had worked for, every early morning, every callus on her hands, was now questioned. Her friend faced possible expulsion, and she faced the collapse of her hard-earned reputation. The disciplinary hearing was scheduled for that afternoon. Ravi sat alone at a table, facing the panel of officers. The mechanic looked smaller somehow, his usually confident posture diminished by the gravity of the situation. "The modifications were unauthorized," Colonel Rathore stated flatly. "This constitutes tampering with military equipment." Just as the colonel prepared to announce the punishment, the door swung open. Dev Mehra strode in, his uniform crisp and his expression determined. "Permission to speak, sir," Dev requested formally. The colonel nodded, surprise briefly crossing his weathered features. "Desai's modifications aren't cheating, they're engineering excellence," Dev stated firmly. "I've studied what he's done. Any shooter could use that rifle, but only Singh has the skill to maximize its potential." A murmur rippled through the room as Dev, once Anaya's fiercest competitor, defended both her and Ravi. He produced technical diagrams and performance calculations, demonstrating how the modifications were within acceptable parameters, innovative rather than illegal. "If we punish innovation, sir, we punish progress itself," Dev concluded. The colonel studied Dev's evidence carefully before turning to Ravi. "You should have requested permission through proper channels, Desai." "Yes, sir," Ravi acknowledged. After deliberation, the colonel issued his verdict. Ravi would face restricted privileges rather than expulsion, and Anaya would continue with standard-issue equipment until formal approval for modification. Outside the hearing room, Anaya approached Dev with questioning eyes. "Why did you do that?" Dev's usual arrogance had softened into something resembling respect. "Because talent deserves fair recognition, even when it wears a different face than expected." The morning of the demonstration dawned with an unnatural stillness that veterans recognized as deceptive. Colonel Arvind Rathore had arranged everything meticulously. The visiting generals, the precisely measured target at 3,100 meters, and the single shot that would determine if Anaya Singh's journey ended here or continued into legend. "You understand what's at stake," the colonel said, his voice low as officers from Delhi gathered at the observation point. His eyes betrayed a conflict between duty and something resembling hope. Anaya nodded, feeling the weight of her rifle, the one with markings from the colonel's own mentor. The weapon felt alive in her hands, connecting her to a lineage she never knew she belonged to. She positioned herself at the firing point, aware of the whispers behind her. "Impossible distance," someone muttered, "even for a seasoned marksman." The cadet took a deep breath, remembering evenings spent with her mother, Mira, learning the patient art of embroidery, how to maintain perfect tension, how to anticipate the path of the thread. She thought of Ravi's late-night adjustments to her firearm, his belief in her unwavering. She recalled Dev's surprising solidarity, a rivalry transformed into respect. As she prepared her stance, the desert betrayed them all. The wind that had been dormant suddenly awakened with fury, sending dust devils dancing across the range. The flags at the distance markers snapped violently in different directions, making calculations nearly impossible. "Perhaps we should postpone," one of the generals suggested, but Anaya shook her head. "I can make the shot," she said, her voice steady, despite the chaos around her. The young woman closed her eyes briefly, feeling the wind against her skin, listening to its whispers across the sand. This wasn't about mathematics anymore. It was about intuition, about knowing the desert as intimately as she knew the weight of her rifle. When she opened her eyes, everything else disappeared. Not the officers watching, not the colonel's career hanging in the balance, not even her mother's fears or Ravi's faith. There was only the target, the wind, and her breath. Anaya squeezed the trigger. The crack echoed across the training ground, followed by an eternal moment of silence. Through the spotting scope, the colonel's expression shifted from tension to disbelief, then to something that might have been pride. "Direct hit," he announced, his voice carrying across the range. The visiting officers stood speechless as the impossible was confirmed. 3,100 meters, a distance that separated legends from ordinary soldiers. In that moment, as the desert wind continued its dance, Anaya knew that everything had changed. Her steady hands had carried more than a bullet across the sand. They had carried her future. The shot that should have been Dev Mehra's moment of glory never came. As the officers watched with anticipation, he deliberately misaligned his scope, ensuring his bullet would miss by meters. When Colonel Arvind Rathore questioned his uncharacteristic failure, Dev simply shrugged, his eyes briefly meeting Anaya's across the range. The message was clear to her alone. This was his gift, born not from pity but profound respect. "Equipment malfunction, sir," Dev stated flatly, though they both knew better. The son of 3 generations of military officers had sacrificed his own chance to shine, understanding that Anaya's success would change more than just her future. That evening, as the base quieted, Dev approached Anaya at the maintenance shed. "My father would disown me if he knew," he said with a half-smile. But some traditions deserve to be broken. The rivalry that had defined them for months dissolved into something neither had expected, solidarity forged in the crucible of shared struggle. Their newfound alliance was tested the very next day when Anaya received an urgent call from home. Meera Singh had collapsed while preparing dinner, her fever spiking dangerously high. Winter had descended on Rajasthan with unusual severity, and pneumonia had taken hold of her weakened lungs. "Go," Ravi urged, his hands still greasy from rifle maintenance. "The colonel will understand." But understanding and permission were different matters entirely. The demonstration squad was scheduled for a critical evaluation that would determine their future assignments. Anaya's absence would almost certainly mean removal. For 5 grueling days, Anaya split herself between worlds. She would train from dawn until mid-afternoon, then race to her mother's bedside, administering medication and cooling her burning forehead through the night. Sleep became a luxury she could no longer afford. On the 6th day, when her body threatened to collapse from exhaustion, she arrived at the range to find Dev and Ravi had covered her morning duties. The colonel watched from his office window, saying nothing but noting everything. "Your mother?" Dev asked quietly as they prepared their firearms. "Fever broke last night," Anaya replied, her voice barely audible over the mechanical clicks of their weapons. "The doctor says she'll recover." What remained unspoken was the cost, the tremor in her hands that hadn't been there before, the dark circles beneath her eyes, the weight that had fallen from her already slight frame. Yet each morning, Anaya Singh appeared on the range, her dedication unwavering despite everything. It was this, not just her marksmanship, that gradually transformed the whispers around her. The very people who had laughed now watched with quiet admiration as she shouldered burdens that would have broken many of them. The summer heat once again scorched the Rajasthan landscape, but this time, Anaya Singh stood differently beneath it. The base commander had summoned her to his office, where Colonel Arvind Rathore waited with uncharacteristic stillness. When she entered, he rose and gestured to a wooden case on his desk. "This belongs to you now," he said, opening it to reveal her rifle, but transformed. The weathered metal now bore an elegant engraving, 3,100 meters. The colonel's eyes, usually stern, held something new. Not as a novelty or exception, Anaya, as the standard to which others must aspire. She ran her fingers over the marking, remembering the impossible shot that had silenced even her harshest critics. The engraving represented more than distance. It measured the journey from mockery to respect. Your steadiness under pressure isn't just talent, the officer continued. It's discipline few possess, regardless of background. He extended his hand, a gesture that acknowledged her not as a curiosity, but as a soldier who had earned her place. That evening, Anaya returned to her family home, where Mira waited with chai and a quiet pride that had replaced her earlier fears. Mother and daughter sat in the courtyard, the familiar scent of jasmine surrounding them. "I brought you something," Anaya said, presenting her mother with an intricately embroidered shawl she had worked on during rare moments of rest. Mira traced the patterns with the same delicate touch her daughter applied to the rifle's trigger. "You never abandoned your first lessons," she observed. "They were the foundation of everything else," Anaya replied. The two women, once divided by different dreams, now recognized the courage in each other's choices. Mira's sacrifice of her singing ambitions had given Anaya the strength to pursue her own path. Their understanding had evolved beyond the constraints of tradition into something more profound: mutual respect. At the base the following day, Ravi Desai approached with his characteristic shy smile. The mechanic's hands were stained with oil, but he carried himself with new confidence since his contributions had been officially recognized. Dev Mehra joined them, nodding at Anaya with the respect of a worthy competitor. "The new cadets are asking for you," he said. "They want to learn your breathing technique." The three stood together in comfortable silence, transformed by the months of struggle. Where once there had been hierarchy and distance, now stood equals, united by shared purpose. As the sun set over the training grounds, Anaya realized that her victory wasn't simply in proving her critics wrong. It was in forging connections that transcended the rigid boundaries she had once fought against. The rifle rested on the display stand, its once weathered barrel now gleaming under the glass case. The mark etched into its side, 3,100 meters, caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows of the Rajasthan Military Academy's Hall of Honors. Anaya Singh stood before it, her fingers hovering just above the glass, remembering the weight of the weapon that had changed everything. "They still talk about that shot," Colonel Arvind Rathore said, approaching from behind. The decorated officer's uniform was adorned with medals that clinked softly as he moved. 3,100 meters. Even I couldn't believe it until I saw it with my own eyes. Anaya smiled, the memory of that day vivid in her mind. The howling desert wind, the impossible distance, the collective breath held by everyone present. "The rifle deserves most of the credit," she replied. "We both know that's not true," the colonel said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had finally reconciled tradition with progress. It wasn't just about hitting a target. It was about changing minds. Beyond the academy walls, her story had spread across Rajasthan like wildfire. Young women from villages arrived at recruitment centers clutching newspaper clippings about the cadet who defied expectations. Applications from female candidates had tripled. Mira had been the most surprising convert of all. Her mother now proudly displayed Anaya's achievements in their modest home, the same space where she had once begged her daughter to follow a more traditional path. The illness that had nearly taken her had instead given her a new perspective on dreams deferred. Dev Mehra and Ravi Desai entered the hall together, an unlikely friendship forged in the crucible of shared respect. The mechanic's technical innovations had earned him a promotion, while Dev had found something more valuable than family legacy: authentic purpose. "The demonstration squad leaves for Delhi tomorrow," Dev announced. "They've requested you lead the precision shooting exhibition." Anaya nodded, thinking of all the moments that had led here, her grandmother's lessons in patience, the nights spent training in secret, the ridicule that had hardened her resolve rather than breaking it. "Your grandmother would have been proud," the colonel said quietly, knowing the full circle of her journey. As they walked out into the blazing Rajasthani sun, Anaya realized her triumph wasn't measured in meters or marked on metal. It echoed in changed minds, in doors opened, in traditions not abandoned but expanded. The desert wind carried whispers of her name to places she had never been, inspiring others to steady their hands against whatever odds they faced. History would remember her not for breaking tradition, but for giving it new meaning, proving that honor and progress could stand side by side, as steady as her hands had been on that legendary day.